The year is 1927. The sun rises over the banks of a muddy river in Dearborn, Michigan, casting long shadows across a landscape that no longer belongs to nature. Steam pours from smokestacks that stretch toward a gray sky, while ore boats glide up a waterway that men had carved wider just so ships could reach this place. The sound is deafening, a constant mechanical thunder rolling across 16 million square feet of factory floor, across 93 buildings connected by 100 miles of railroad track, across a foundry that alone covers 30 acres and employs 10,000 men. Inside, molten iron glows orange at temperatures that could melt bone. Conveyors stretch for 120 miles, carrying metal and parts and the dreams of a nation that believed it could manufacture its way to greatness. 100,000 workers punch the clock here. 100,000 men who breathe the same air thick with coal dust and furnace smoke, who feel the same. Vibration through the concrete floor, who watch raw iron ore arrive on ships and witness it, leave as automobiles. Every 49 seconds, another car rolls off the line. This is the Ford River Rouge complex, the largest factory the world has ever seen. The place where Henry Ford proved that a single man with enough ambition and enough capital could remake the very nature of work itself. The temple of vertical integration, where rubber became tires, sand became glass, iron ore became steel, and steel became the machines that would carry America into the 20th century. At its peak, this complex generated enough electricity to power a city the size of Boston. It consumed more coal than some European nations. It turned raw materials into finished automobiles without ever leaving the property. A continuous process from earth to engine, from mine to Model A. Henry Ford called it the most efficient factory in human history. He was probably right. But efficiency has a price, and the men who paid it were not the ones counting the profits. Was the Rouge a triumph of American ingenuity, the engine that powered a century of prosperity? Or was it a machine designed to consume men as surely as it consumed coal, a place where the pursuit of perfect efficiency demanded the surrender of everything that made work human? In 1893, in a brick shed behind his home on Bagley Avenue in Detroit, a 30-year-old engineer named Henry Ford completed his first gasoline-powered vehicle. It was crude, dangerous, and unreliable. It could barely reach 20 miles per hour. But it worked, and in that moment of mechanical success, a future began to take shape that would transform not just an industry, but the very fabric of American labor. Ford was not the first to build an automobile. Carl Benz in Germany, Ransom Olds in Michigan, dozens of tinkerers and engineers had been experimenting with horseless carriages for decades. But Ford possessed something that his competitors often lacked: an obsessive, almost pathological hatred of waste. He could not tolerate inefficiency. He could not accept that a task might take 10 minutes when it could be done in 5. This was not mere business calculation. It was something closer to religion. Every wasted second was a sin against the natural order of productive work. The young Ford had grown up on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan, just miles from where his great factory would eventually rise. He had watched his father and neighbors struggle with the backbreaking labor of agricultural work, and he had come to believe that machinery could liberate humanity from the curse of physical toil. This was not an unusual belief in late 19th century America, where inventors and entrepreneurs were celebrated as heroes who would lead mankind into a new age of prosperity and progress. But Ford took this belief further than most. He did not merely want to build machines. He wanted to build machines so efficient that they would render all previous methods of production obsolete. The Ford Motor Company was incorporated in 1903 with $12,000 in capital. For the first decade, it operated much like any other automobile manufacturer of the era, building cars one at a time in a relatively small factory, employing skilled craftsmen who assembled entire vehicles from start to finish. A worker might spend days on a single automobile, moving around the chassis, attaching parts, adjusting components. It was slow, it was expensive, and it required a workforce of trained mechanics who understood every aspect of the machine they were building. Ford found this intolerable, not because it didn't work, but because he could imagine something better. In his mind, he saw a different kind of factory, one where the car moved and the worker stood still, one where each man performed a single task, repeated endlessly, perfected through sheer repetition until human error became impossible. One where the rhythm of production was set not by the skills of individual craftsmen, but by the mechanical pace of the assembly line itself. In 1910, Ford moved his operations to a new facility in Highland Park, Michigan. The architect Albert Kahn designed the building with enormous windows that flooded the workspace with natural light, a departure from the dark, cramped factories of the 19th century. It was here that Ford and his engineers began the experiments that would revolutionize industrial production. They broke down the assembly process into 84 discrete steps. They mounted components on moving platforms. They timed each task with a stopwatch, searching for ways to shave seconds from every operation. By 1913, the moving assembly line was operational. A Model T that had once required 12.5 hours to build could now be completed in 93 minutes. The results were staggering. Production doubled, then tripled, then kept climbing. By 1925, Ford factories were producing 10,000 Model T automobiles every single day. The price of a car dropped from $850 to just under $300. Automobile ownership, once a luxury reserved for the wealthy, became possible for working families across America. Henry Ford had not merely built a better factory, he had democratized transportation itself. But there was a cost that the company's promotional materials never mentioned. The same efficiency that made automobiles affordable made the work of building them almost unbearable. The moving assembly line transformed factory labor from skilled craft into mechanical repetition. A worker who had once taken pride in building a complete automobile now spent his entire shift attaching the same bolt over and over, thousands of times per day. The pace was relentless. The conveyor never stopped. Fall behind, and the entire line would grind to a halt. The pressure was enormous, and it took its toll. By late 1913, Ford's labor turnover rate had reached 370%. To maintain a workforce of 14,000, the company had to hire more than 52,000 men per year. Workers quit faster than they could be replaced. Some lasted only days before the monotony and the pressure drove them away. The assembly line had solved the problem of production, but it had created a new problem: how to keep men working on machines that treated them like machines themselves. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford announced his solution. Ford Motor Company would pay its workers $5 for an 8-hour day. This was more than double the prevailing wage in American manufacturing. It was more than most skilled craftsmen earned. It was, quite simply, the highest industrial wage in the history of the world. The announcement made headlines around the globe. 10,000 men showed up at the Highland Park plant the next morning, hoping for a job. Newspapers praised Ford as a visionary and a humanitarian. Here was a capitalist who understood that workers were not merely costs to be minimized, but potential customers to be cultivated. Pay men enough to buy the products they make, and you create an endless cycle of production and consumption that benefits everyone. But the $5 day was not the gift it appeared to be. The base wage remained at $2.34. The additional money came from a profit-sharing program, and eligibility required meeting conditions that reached deep into workers' private lives. To qualify, an employee had to be at least 22 years old, with 6 months at the company. He had to abstain from alcohol. He had to maintain a clean and orderly home. He had to keep his children in school. He had to contribute regularly to a savings account. He had to demonstrate thrift, sobriety, and what Ford called good moral character. Women were ineligible, unless they were single mothers with dependents. Men were disqualified if their wives worked outside the home. To enforce these requirements, Ford created the Sociological Department. 200 investigators were deployed to monitor employees' lives beyond the factory gates. They made unannounced visits to workers' homes, checking for cleanliness, asking questions about spending habits, observing family dynamics. They reviewed bank records to verify savings deposits. They checked school attendance records for workers' children. They noted whether families took in boarders, which Ford considered evidence of financial irresponsibility. They evaluated workers by nationality, rating the living conditions of Poles, Italians, Greeks, and other immigrant groups on scales from good to poor. The Sociological Department also operated the Ford English School, where immigrant workers were required to learn English as a condition of employment. The graduation ceremonies made the company's philosophy unmistakable. Workers would enter dressed in the traditional clothing of their home countries and descend into a giant prop melting pot on the stage. They would emerge wearing American suits and ties, their old identities symbolically dissolved, their new identities as Ford workers and Ford consumers now complete. This was control masquerading as benevolence. The $5 day purchased not just labor, but compliance. Workers who might otherwise have complained about the brutal pace of the assembly line, who might have organized to demand better conditions, who might have questioned whether human beings should be treated as interchangeable parts in a vast industrial machine, found themselves bound to the company by wages they could not earn anywhere else. To protest was to risk losing not just a job, but an entire way of life that the higher wages had made possible. The mortgage on the new bungalow, the payments on the Model T, the expectation of a steady income that had allowed workers to plan for a future that factory labor had never before offered. Henry Ford understood something that few of his contemporaries grasped. The carrot could be a more effective instrument of control than the stick. Pay a man enough, and he will tolerate conditions that would otherwise be intolerable. Give him something to lose, and he will guard it more fiercely than any employer ever could. By 1915, the Highland Park plant was running at full capacity, but Henry Ford was already looking beyond it. He had purchased 2,000 acres of swampland along the Rouge River, southwest of Detroit. The property was worthless by any conventional measure, a stretch of bottomland that flooded regularly and required extensive drainage before any construction could begin. But Ford saw something in that muddy terrain that others could not. He saw the future of industrial production. The Rouge River connected to the Detroit River, which connected to the Great Lakes, which connected to the iron ore deposits of Minnesota and the coal fields of Appalachia. With enough dredging and engineering, Ford could bring the raw materials of automobile production directly to his factory door. No middlemen, no transportation costs that enriched railroad companies and shipping firms. No dependence on suppliers who might raise prices or fail to deliver. Complete vertical integration, complete control. Construction began in 1917, accelerated by a request from the United States Navy. The country had entered World War I, and Under Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Ford to build submarine chasers for the war effort. Ford agreed, and the first building at the Rouge site, known as Building B, rose to fulfill the government contract. The Eagle boats, as they were called, never saw combat. The war ended before any could be deployed, but the project served a purpose far more valuable to Ford than any military contract. It justified the dredging and widening of the Rouge River, creating a channel deep enough and wide enough to accommodate the enormous ore freighters that would carry raw materials to the plant for decades to come. Once the channel was complete, Ford's vision accelerated. The architect Albert Kahn, who had designed the Highland Park plant, was commissioned to create the buildings that would house Ford's most ambitious project. Kahn had revolutionized industrial architecture by introducing reinforced concrete construction and vast expanses of glass that flooded factory floors with natural light. His designs for the Rouge would push these innovations further than ever before. The buildings Kahn designed were functional to an extreme degree. Every element served production. The glass walls that became his signature were not aesthetic choices, but practical ones, reducing the need for artificial lighting and lowering operating costs. The reinforced concrete frames allowed for open floor plans without interior columns, giving engineers maximum flexibility in arranging machinery and assembly lines. The buildings were designed to accommodate change, to be reconfigured as production methods evolved. Coke ovens came online in October of 1919. These massive structures converted coal into coke, the purified carbon fuel required for steelmaking. The process generated enormous quantities of byproducts: coal tar, ammonia, benzene, and dozens of other chemicals that Ford captured and sold or used in other manufacturing processes. Nothing was wasted. Every output became an input for something else. Blast furnaces followed in 1920 and 1922. These towering structures, some reaching over 100 feet in height, transformed iron ore into molten pig iron through a process that had remained essentially unchanged since the Industrial Revolution. But Ford's blast furnaces operated at unprecedented scale and efficiency. They consumed iron ore, coke, and limestone in carefully calibrated proportions, producing pig iron that flowed directly to the foundry for casting or to the steel mills for further refinement. A massive power plant began operations in 1920, generating enough electricity to supply all of the Rouge's needs, one-third of the Highland Park plant's requirements, and still have surplus to sell to Detroit Edison. The power plant burned a mixture of fuels, coal, natural gas, and the gases captured from the coke ovens and blast furnaces. This energy recycling was another expression of Ford's obsession with efficiency. Heat that would otherwise have been vented to the atmosphere was captured and converted to electricity. The foundry opened, covering 30 acres, the largest on Earth at the time. Here, molten iron was poured into molds to create engine blocks, cylinder heads, and the countless other cast components that went into every Ford automobile. The foundry alone employed 10,000 men, working in conditions that combined extreme heat, deafening noise, and constant exposure to metal dust and fumes. It was among the most dangerous workplaces in the complex, and injuries were common. A glass plant using a continuous production process that Ford had helped develop began making windshields and windows. Traditional glassmaking produced sheets one at a time, a slow and expensive process that required skilled craftsmen. Ford's continuous process drew molten glass through rollers in an unbroken ribbon that could be cut to size as needed. The result was cheaper glass produced faster. Another example of assembly line principles applied to a traditional craft: steel rolling mills, a tire plant that processed rubber into finished tires ready for installation, a paper mill that produced the cardboard used for packaging, a cement plant, a textile mill for seat upholstery, a soybean conversion facility that turned agricultural products into plastic automotive components, part of Ford's experiments with what he called chirurgy, the industrial use of farm products. By 1928, the Rouge complex was complete, 1.5 miles wide, more than a mile long. 93 buildings connected by 100 miles of internal railroad track and 120 miles of conveyor belts. 16 locomotives moved more than 1,600 freight cars daily across the property. A scheduled bus network and 15 miles of paved roads kept workers and materials in constant motion. The power plant alone consumed enough coal to heat a major city. At its peak, more than 100,000 workers would punch the clock here. Ford called it an ore-to-assembly complex. Iron ore arrived on ships from the northern Great Lakes. Coal came from mines that Ford owned in Kentucky and West Virginia. Limestone quarries in Michigan supplied the flux needed for steel making. Rubber came from Ford's own plantation in Brazil, a disastrous venture called Fordlandia that demonstrated the lengths to which Ford would go to control his supply chain. In 1928, Ford had purchased a tract of land in the Amazon basin nearly the size of Connecticut, intending to grow rubber trees and free himself from dependence on British-controlled plantations in Southeast Asia. He built an entire American town in the jungle, complete with Cape Cod-style houses, a golf course, a swimming pool, and a hospital. He prohibited alcohol, tobacco, and women from the workers' dormitories. He required the Brazilian laborers to eat American food and observe American customs. The project was a catastrophe. The rubber trees, planted in neat rows as they might have been in Michigan, fell prey to leaf blight that would never have affected them in their natural scattered distribution. The workers rebelled against the cultural impositions, rioting in 1930 when Ford tried to enforce cafeteria-style dining. The jungle insects and the tropical heat proved all unmanageable. By the time Ford sold the plantation back to the Brazilian government in 1945, he had lost the equivalent of $200 million in today's currency and had never shipped a single ounce of commercially viable rubber. Fordlandia revealed something essential about its founder. Henry Ford believed so deeply in the universal applicability of his methods that he could not imagine them failing, even in an environment utterly unlike the one for which they had been designed. The assembly line worked in Michigan, so it would work in the Amazon. American values produced prosperity in Dearborn, so they would produce prosperity in the Brazilian jungle. This inability to recognize the limits of his own vision would haunt Ford throughout his later years, as the world he had helped create moved in directions he could not understand and would not accept. Timber from 700,000 acres of Ford-owned forest in the Upper Peninsula. At the Rouge, these Raw materials were transformed through every stage of manufacturing until finished, automobiles rolled off the assembly line. The company's promotional materials claimed that an automobile could be completed within 28 hours of raw ore arriving at the docks. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Visitors came from around the world to witness the Rouge in operation. Charles Lindbergh toured the facility shortly after his transatlantic flight. So did Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, and dozens of heads of state and captains of industry. Free bus tours began in 1924 and continued for more than 50 years, attracting nearly 1 million visitors annually at their peak. The Rouge was not just a factory, it was a monument to American industrial might. In 1932, the Detroit Institute of Arts commissioned Mexican artist Diego Rivera to paint a series of murals depicting the industries of Detroit. Rivera spent 3 months touring the Rouge, sketching the workers and machines, studying the processes that transformed raw materials into finished goods. He arrived at 4 a.m. to watch the night shift, stood for hours observing the movements of workers on the assembly line, filled sketchbooks with studies of hands and faces and machinery. His wife, the artist Frida Kahlo, accompanied him, though she found Detroit dreary and was eager to return to Mexico. The result was 27 fresco panels that covered the walls of the museum's garden court. They remain there today, a permanent record of how the Rouge looked at the height of its power. Rivera painted the blast furnaces glowing orange with molten metal. He painted the stamping presses and the welding bucks and the assembly lines where men worked in synchronized motion. He painted the diverse workforce, red and black and yellow and white figures holding the raw materials of automobile production. He included references to the natural world from which those materials came, the iron ore and limestone, the sand and coal. He depicted the workers not as victims, but as heroes, their bodies powerful and their labor dignified, even as the murals subtly critiqued the system that employed them. And in one controversial panel, he painted a child being vaccinated, surrounded by the animals that provided the serum, a secular nativity scene where medical technology replaced religious salvation. Some viewers were outraged. They called the murals communistic, sacrilegious, anti-American. A city councilman introduced a resolution demanding that they be scrubbed from the walls. Religious leaders condemned the vaccination panel as blasphemous. Corporate leaders objected to Rivera's known communist sympathies. Edsel Ford, Henry's son, and a patron of the arts who had championed the commission, defended the murals against their critics. He argued that Rivera had created a masterpiece that honored both the workers and the industry of Detroit. The murals survived the controversy, protected by Edsel's influence and by the growing recognition that Rivera had produced something extraordinary. The murals were designated a National Historic Landmark in 2014. But Rivera had arrived in Detroit just days after an event that revealed the darker truth behind the industrial marvel he had come to document. The prosperity of the 1920s had made the Rouge the largest industrial facility in the world. Then came October of 1929. The stock market crashed, banks failed, credit vanished, demand for automobiles collapsed almost overnight. In February of 1929, Ford had employed 98,939 workers. By 1931, only 37,000 remained on the payroll. The human consequences were devastating. The average annual wage for auto workers, which had reached $1,639 in 1929, fell 54% to just $757 by 1931. In Detroit, unemployment approached 50%. As many as 100,000 people fled the city in search of work elsewhere. Those who remained faced a desperate struggle for survival. The welfare allowance was 15 cents per person per day. There was no unemployment insurance, no Social Security, no safety net of any kind. Banks closed, wiping out the life savings of workers who had dutifully followed Ford's instructions to deposit their wages in savings accounts. Detroit recorded 568 suicides in 1931, up from 113 just 4 years earlier. Henry Ford's response was characteristic of his worldview. He blamed the workers themselves for their misery. He suggested that unemployment was caused by laziness and lack of initiative. He refused to accept that the economic system itself might bear any responsibility for the suffering it had produced. On March 7th, 1932, Between 3,000 and 5,000 unemployed workers gathered in Detroit for what would become known as the Ford Hunger March. Organized by the Unemployed Councils, a Communist Party initiative, the march began in downtown Detroit and proceeded toward the River Rouge complex. The demonstrators carried banners demanding jobs, an end to discrimination, relief for laid-off workers. They asked only for the right to present their demands to the company that had once employed them. At the Dearborn city limits, they were met by police with tear gas. The marchers pushed forward. At Gate 4 of the Rouge complex, they encountered a line of Dearborn police officers and Ford security personnel. What happened next depends on who tells the story. Company officials claimed the workers became violent, that rocks and frozen clods of mud were thrown at officers and security guards. Witnesses among the marchers said the violence came entirely from the other side, that police and Ford men opened fire on an unarmed crowd. The facts are beyond dispute. When the shooting stopped, 4 workers lay dead in the frozen mud: Joe York, Coleman Lenny, Joe DeBlasio, and Joe Bussell. More than 60 others had been wounded by gunfire. Harry Bennett, the head of Ford's service department, had arrived at the scene and reportedly emptied 2 pistols into the crowd before being knocked unconscious by a thrown rock. Police had used fire hoses, tear gas, and machine guns against men whose only crime was demanding bread. 5 days later, an estimated 60,000 people lined Woodward Avenue in Detroit for the funeral procession of the 4 dead marchers. They were buried in Woodmere Cemetery, in a common grave within sight of the Rouge complex that had once employed them. A 5th marcher, Curtis Williams, an African-American, died of his injuries 5 months later. The cemetery's whites-only policy prevented his burial alongside the others. His remains were cremated, his ashes scattered near the graves of his fellow workers. No Ford or Dearborn official was ever charged with a crime. The local newspapers, which had initially condemned the marchers as communist agitators, gradually shifted their tone as more facts emerged. But the acknowledgement changed nothing. The dead remained dead. The unemployed remained unemployed. The Ford Hunger March revealed what many had long suspected, that behind the benevolent image of the $5 day lurked something far darker. The Ford Motor Company did not merely employ workers, it controlled them. And the instrument of that control was a private army that operated beyond the reach of law. Harry Bennett had arrived at Ford in 1917. He was a former boxer, a Navy veteran with a reputation for violence and an unsettling personal loyalty to Henry Ford. Within a decade, he had risen to command the Ford Service Department, nominally a security force, in practice something closer to an industrial mafia. The New York Times called it the largest private quasi-military organization in existence. At its peak, the Service Department employed 3,000 men, former convicts, ex-athletes, prize fighters, bouncers, gangsters, and informers recruited from Detroit's underworld. Their primary function was suppressing any hint of labor organization within Ford facilities. Workers were monitored constantly, both inside the plants and beyond. Service Department informers infiltrated churches, bars, barbershops, and social clubs where Ford employees gathered. They reported on conversations, on associations, on any expression of discontent or sympathy for unions. Workers who spoke favorably of organized labor, who attended union meetings, or who simply complained too loudly about conditions on the assembly line could expect a visit from Bennett's men. Some were merely fired. Others received beatings that sent them to the hospital. The message was unmistakable: Ford Motor Company would tolerate no challenge to its authority. Between 1937 and 1941, some 4,000 workers were fired from Ford plants for suspected union sympathies. Dearborn, where the Rouge complex was located, had become a company town in the most complete sense of the term. Ford controlled the local government. Ford police worked alongside municipal police. Ford interests shaped local policy on everything from zoning to taxation to the enforcement of laws against labor organizing. The relationship between Ford and African American workers was particularly complex. Henry Ford had earned a reputation as a friend to black workers at a time when most industrial employers refused to hire them at all, or relegated them to the most dangerous and poorly paid positions. At the Rouge, African American men worked alongside whites on the assembly lines, a rarity in American manufacturing. Ford recruited heavily from the black community in Detroit, working through ministers and community leaders to identify potential employees. By the late 1930s, the Rouge employed more African Americans than any other factory in the country, approximately 10,000 men. But this apparent progressivism served Ford's interests as much as it served black workers. African American employees were concentrated in the foundry, the most dangerous and physically demanding part of the operation, where temperatures could exceed 140 degrees and the air was thick with silica dust that destroyed men's lungs. They were rarely promoted to supervisory positions, and Ford expected their loyalty in return for the jobs he provided, a loyalty that he would attempt to exploit when the union finally came to organize the Rouge. The black community in Detroit was divided over Ford. Some leaders, particularly ministers whose churches received donations from the company, praised Ford as a benefactor and urged their congregations to resist the UAWs. Others recognized that Ford's hiring practices, however exceptional for their time, still relegated black workers to the worst jobs and expected gratitude in exchange. When the 1941 strike came, this division would be put to the test. The United Auto Workers Union, founded in 1935, had achieved remarkable success at other automakers. General Motors recognized the UAW after the Flint sit-down strike of 1936 and 37, a dramatic action in which workers occupied the Fisher body plants in Flint, Michigan, refusing to leave until the company agreed to negotiate. Chrysler followed shortly thereafter, but Ford remained implacably opposed. Henry Ford's hatred of unions went beyond business calculation. It was personal, almost visceral. He believed that unions represented foreign influences, communist agitation, the corruption of American values of individual initiative and hard work. On May 26, 1937, the UAW planned a leaflet campaign at the Rouge. Organizers including Walter Reuther and Richard Frankenstein would distribute handbills near Gate 4 on the pedestrian overpass above Miller Road, where workers entered and exited the plant during shift changes. The leaflets demanded a 6-hour day for $8, in contrast to the 8-hour day for $6 then in place. They promised that the UAW would end the Ford service system. They cited the union's success at General Motors and Chrysler as evidence that change was possible. Reuther had invited newspapermen, priests, and local officials to witness the leaflet distribution. He had obtained a permit from the city of Dearborn. He expected confrontation, but he believed that the presence of neutral observers would restrain the violence he knew Bennett's men were capable of. He was wrong. Before the organizers could begin distributing their leaflets, 40 men from the service department surrounded them. What followed became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Reuther was picked up and slammed repeatedly onto the concrete, then kicked down 2 flights of stairs. Frankenstein had his coat pulled over his head and was beaten unconscious. Other organizers were thrown from the overpass, some falling 30 feet to the pavement below. Women from the UAW's auxiliary, who had come to help distribute leaflets, were also attacked. In all, 16 union members were injured, including 7 women. Bennett's men tried to destroy the evidence. They confiscated cameras and film from the news photographers present. But one photographer, James Kilpatrick of the Detroit News, managed to swap the exposed film out of his camera before surrendering it. His photographs were published in newspapers across the country. They showed Ford security men surrounding and beating defenseless union organizers. They showed Reuther's bloodied face and Frankenstein's torn and blood-stained shirt. They showed what the Ford Motor Company was willing to do to maintain its control over its workers. Bennett denied everything, but the photographs spoke for themselves. Public opinion shifted decisively in favor of the union. The National Labor Relations Board pursued a case against Ford that brought to light years of illegal interference with workers' rights to organize. Still, Ford refused to yield. For 4 more years, Bennett and his men continued their campaign of intimidation. Workers who joined the UAW did so at the risk of their jobs and their safety. But the union grew anyway. By early 1941, membership at the Rouge was climbing rapidly. Workers wore union buttons on the line. They elected shop stewards. They forced the company to bargain, even as Ford continued to insist that it would never recognize the UAW. On April 1, 1941, Ford fired 8 union members. The response was immediate. Workers in the rolling mill stopped working. Within hours, the strike spread throughout the Rouge complex. For the first time in its history, the massive factory was shut down by a workers' action. The strike lasted 10 days. Tens of thousands of workers manned picket lines around the facility, forming human chains that stretched for miles along the roads leading to the plant gates. Women volunteers set up field kitchens and made thousands of sandwiches to feed the strikers. Local businesses donated food and supplies. The solidarity that the company had tried so hard to suppress emerged with a force that surprised even the union leadership. The company tried to use racial tensions to break the walkout, encouraging African American workers to cross the picket lines. Ford's strategy exploited the real divisions that existed within the workforce. Black workers had reason to be grateful to Ford for jobs that other companies would not provide. They had reason to be suspicious of unions that had historically excluded them or relegated them to segregated locals, and they faced pressure from community leaders, some of whom had financial relationships with the company, to demonstrate their loyalty. Some African American workers did cross the picket lines. They were met with anger and sometimes violence from white strikers. For a moment, it seemed that Ford's strategy might succeed, that the racial divisions he was exploiting might tear the union apart before it could achieve its goals. But the UAW had prepared for this moment. Black organizers within the union worked to counter Ford's propaganda. They reminded African American workers that the union was fighting for better conditions for all workers, regardless of race. They pointed out that the jobs Ford provided came with the worst working conditions in the plant, and that only union representation could improve those conditions. And they argued that black workers had more to gain from solidarity with their fellow workers than from loyalty to a company that confined them to the foundry. Enough black workers remained with the union to prevent the company's tactic from succeeding. The picket lines held. Production remained at a standstill, and as the days passed, it became clear that Ford could not simply wait out the strike. The costs were mounting, and the government, now preparing for war, was pressuring the company to settle. Henry Ford initially threatened to shut down his plants permanently rather than recognize the UAW. He told associates that he would rather destroy everything he had built than submit to collective bargaining. He meant it. His hatred of unions had become so intense that he could not imagine compromise. But his wife Clara intervened. She reportedly told him that she would leave him if he caused any more bloodshed. Clara Ford had watched her husband's growing rigidity and anger with increasing alarm. She had seen the violence of the Hunger March and the Battle of the Overpass. She feared what might happen if Henry ordered his security forces to break the strike by force, and she made clear that she would not stand by him if he chose that path. The threat worked. On June 20th, 1941, Ford Motor Company signed a contract with the United Auto Workers. The agreement went further than contracts at other automakers, including a union shop provision that required all workers to join the UAW. Some historians have speculated that Ford, having lost the battle, wanted to lose it completely, to demonstrate the extremity of the defeat that his wife and his enemies had forced upon him. Others suggest that the company's negotiators simply gave up more than they needed to, overwhelmed by the pressure of events. Whatever the reason, the contract transformed labor relations at Ford overnight. Henry Ford never accepted the change. He blamed outside agitators, communists, his own son, Edsel, anyone but himself. Harry Bennett remained at the company, his power gradually diminishing but never entirely eliminated. Not until 1945, after Henry Ford's grandson took control of the company, was Bennett finally fired. It was the first order of business for Henry Ford II. 6 months after Ford signed its contract with the UAW, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II, and the Rouge complex, like the rest of American industry, was transformed overnight into an arsenal of democracy. The last peacetime automobile rolled off the Rouge assembly line in early 1942. From that moment until the war's end, the massive factory devoted its entire capacity to military production. The transition was not instantaneous. Retooling assembly lines designed for automobiles to produce tanks and aircraft required months of planning and construction. Engineers had to redesign production processes. Workers had to learn new skills. Supply chains had to be reconfigured to deliver military-grade materials instead of civilian components. But once the conversion was complete, the Rouge demonstrated what American industry could accomplish when fully mobilized for war, jeeps, tanks, amphibious vehicles, aircraft engines, armor plating, tires and tubes for military vehicles, superchargers for fighter planes and bombers, gun mounts, ambulances, staff cars. The variety of products was staggering, and the volume was unprecedented. The numbers were staggering. Ford factories produced 277,896 military vehicles during the war. Tanks, armored cars, and the iconic Willys Jeeps that would become synonymous with American military mobility. 13,000 of those Jeeps were amphibious models, engineered with watertight hulls that allowed them to operate on both land and water. These vehicles could drive directly off landing craft into shallow water and proceed to shore under their own power, a capability that proved invaluable in amphibious operations from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. The M4 Sherman tank, the backbone of American armored forces in Europe, relied on components manufactured at the Rouge. The tank's transmission, final drives, and other critical parts were produced on assembly lines that had once made automobile transmissions. Ford workers who had spent years perfecting the manufacture of civilian vehicles now applied those same skills to weapons of war. But vehicles were only part of Ford's contribution. The Rouge also produced 27,000 tank engines, shipped to other assembly plants around the country, where they were installed in completed tanks. It manufactured steel armor plating for tanks, ships, and aircraft, rolling plates of hardened steel that could stop bullets and shell fragments. The same rolling mills that had once produced sheet metal for automobile bodies now produced the protective shells that would save countless lives on distant battlefields. And at the newly constructed Willow Run plant, 30 miles west of the Rouge, Ford workers built B-24, Liberator bombers at a rate that stunned military planners. The facility was so large that the War Department initially doubted it could ever achieve its production targets. The main building covered 67 acres under a single roof, the largest factory building in the world at the time. Assembly lines stretched for nearly a mile. At peak production, a completed B-24 rolled off the line every 55 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The B-24 was one of the most complex machines ever mass-produced. Each bomber contained more than 100,000 parts, including 4 engines, 10 machine guns, and sophisticated navigation and communication equipment. Building them required precision manufacturing to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Ford engineers adapted assembly line techniques developed for automobiles to this far more demanding application, proving that mass production methods could be applied to virtually any manufactured product. War's end, Ford had produced 86,865 complete aircraft, 57,851 airplane engines, and 4,291 military gliders. The company had also manufactured millions of smaller items: generators, gun directors, aircraft superchargers, and countless other components that kept the American military machine running. The war effort transformed the workforce as well as the factory. With millions of men serving overseas, women entered industrial employment in numbers never before seen. At the Rouge and Willow Run, women worked alongside men on assembly lines, operating machinery, welding, riveting, and performing tasks that had previously been considered exclusively male domains. They proved themselves capable workers, and their contributions were essential to meeting the enormous production quotas that the military demanded. These women workers were celebrated in wartime propaganda as symbols of American determination and sacrifice. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, representing the millions of women who had left homes and traditional occupations to work in defense plants. But when the war ended, most of these women were pushed out of industrial employment to make room for returning veterans. The transformation in gender roles that the war had seemed to promise was largely reversed, and the Rouge returned to being an almost exclusively male workplace. The war years represented both the peak of the Rouge's productive power and the beginning of its long decline. At its height in 1947, the complex employed more than 100,000 workers. The factory floor hummed with activity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts rotated in endless cycles, men pouring through the gates as other men streamed out. But Henry Ford himself was failing. He had suffered a series of strokes that left him increasingly incapacitated, his mind wandering, his grip on the company he had built slipping away. His son, Edsel, whom many had hoped would modernize the company and heal the wounds inflicted by decades of autocratic rule, died in 1943 at the age of 49. Some blamed Harry Bennett for Edsel's death, believing that the stress of dealing with Ford's enforcer had contributed to the stomach cancer that killed him. Henry Ford died in April of 1947 at the age of 83, just as his great industrial creation was reaching its maximum capacity. He died in his home at Fairlane during a power outage caused by flooding of the Rouge River. There was something fitting about this. The man who had built an empire on the banks of that river dying in darkness while its waters rose beyond their banks. The post-war era brought changes that Henry Ford, had he lived to see them, would have found deeply troubling. His grandson, Henry Ford II, took control of a company that was losing money at an alarming rate, and organized along lines that had made sense in the 1920s but no longer functioned in the post-war world. The company had no modern cost accounting system. Executives made decisions based on intuition rather than data. The production methods that had once been revolutionary were now outdated, surpassed by innovations at General Motors and Chrysler. The new president brought in a team of young managers, many of them veterans of the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Program, who would become known as the Whiz Kids. They had used statistical analysis to improve the efficiency of military logistics during the war, and they believed the same methods could be applied to automobile manufacturing. Among them was Robert McNamara, who would later become Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. The Whiz Kids applied modern management techniques to a company that had been run for decades on the basis of one man's intuition and will. They introduced cost, accounting systems that allowed managers to track expenses and identify inefficiencies. They conducted market research to understand what customers actually wanted, rather than simply building what Henry Ford thought they should want. They decentralized decision-making, giving division managers more autonomy while holding them accountable for results. Under their leadership, Ford Motor Company began to decentralize. The vertical integration that had made the Rouge unique was gradually dismantled. It made less and less sense for an automobile company to own coal mines and rubber plantations, to smelt its own steel and blow its own glass. Specialized suppliers could produce components more cheaply and often more efficiently. The era of total corporate self-sufficiency was ending. At the same time, a growing awareness of environmental consequences began to reshape public attitudes toward heavy industry. The smokestacks that had once symbolized full employment and national strength now symbolized pollution and waste. Government agencies developed air and water quality standards that imposed costs on facilities like the Rouge that had operated for decades with little concern for their environmental impact. The Rouge began to shrink. Operations that had once been performed in-house were sold off or contracted out to independent suppliers. In 1981, the steelmaking operations at the Rouge became part of a new independent company. When these operations were sold to Rouge Steel in 1989, Ford gave up ownership of all Rouge River frontage and boat docks, as well as about 45% of the original 2,000 acres. The number of workers at the Rouge dropped accordingly. The complex that had employed more than 100,000 people at its peak now employed fewer than 20,000. Buildings that had once hummed with productive activity stood empty, their windows broken, their roofs leaking, their futures uncertain. Families that had worked at the Rouge for 3 generations found themselves looking for jobs elsewhere. The decline of the Rouge was part of a broader collapse that devastated Detroit and the industrial Midwest. The city that had been the arsenal of democracy, the engine room of American manufacturing, began a long slide into poverty and abandonment. Population peaked at nearly 1.9 million in 1950, and then began a decline that would continue for 6 decades. Neighborhoods that had housed auto workers and their families emptied out as jobs disappeared. Houses were abandoned, then stripped for copper and scrap metal, then left to collapse into rubble. Entire blocks reverted to prairie. The causes of this collapse were complex and interrelated. Foreign competition, particularly from Japan and Germany, eroded the market share of American automakers. Union contracts that had once seemed like victories for workers began to be portrayed as burdens that made American companies uncompetitive. Automation reduced the number of workers needed to produce each vehicle, and the very success of the automobile had created the suburban sprawl that allowed factories to relocate to greenfield sites in the South and Southwest, where unions were weaker, wages were lower, and state governments offered generous tax incentives. The Rouge survived because it was too large to abandon entirely and too historically significant to demolish. But it shrank year by year, shedding workers and operations, becoming a shadow of what it had been. The massive power plant that had once generated enough electricity to light a city was shut down. The blast furnaces that had turned ore into steel fell silent. The conveyor belts that had stretched for 120 miles were torn out and scrapped. Through it all, the Rouge continued to operate. It produced Mustangs for 4 decades, one of only 3 locations where Ford manufactured the iconic sports car. It remained Ford's largest assembly plant, even as its relative importance to the company diminished. Then, on February 1st, 1999, the long history of industrial accidents at the Rouge produced its most deadly incident in decades. The power plant at the Rouge complex was 80 years old in 1999. It had been scheduled for replacement, and construction of a new facility was already underway. But the old plant was still operational, still burning the mixture of natural gas, pulverized coal, and blast furnace gas that had powered the Rouge for generations. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an explosion tore through boiler number 6. The blast was so powerful that it blew out windows and scattered debris across the site. A plume of smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles. Workers inside the powerhouse were engulfed in superheated steam and flames. One worker, Donald Harper, a 58-year-old pipe fitter and 35-year veteran of the Rouge, died in the explosion. He had been near retirement. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more workers succumbed to their injuries. Cody Boatwright, 51, Warren Blow, 51, Ken Anderson, 44, John Arsenault, 45, and Ron Maritz, 46. 14 others were critically injured, many suffering burns over most of their bodies. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of neglect that extended back more than a decade. A 1987 study by an engineering firm had recommended replacing the boiler's control systems at a cost of $10 million. Ford had declined, in part because doing so would have required compliance with modern safety regulations. The immediate cause of the explosion was a buildup of natural gas in the boiler when a valve was inadvertently left open. Ford reached a $7 million settlement with the state of Michigan. The agreement included a record $1.5 million civil penalty, the largest ever, levied in the state as a result of an occupational safety investigation. In 2004, a memorial was erected at the Rouge complex bearing bronze plaques with the names and photographs of the 6 workers who had died. The tragedy occurred at a moment when Ford was attempting to reinvent the Rouge for a new century. The company had approved a plan to modernize its oldest and largest manufacturing complex, transforming it from an aging brownfield site into a model of sustainable manufacturing. The architect William McDonough was commissioned to redesign the Rouge complex according to principles of environmental sustainability that would have been unimaginable to Henry Ford. The philosophy behind McDonough's design was simple in principle, but revolutionary in practice. Waste equals food. Every output of an industrial process should be designed to become an input for another process. Nothing should be discarded. The factory of the future should work with nature rather than against it. The new Dearborn truck plant, which opened in 2004, featured a living roof covering more than 10 acres with sedum, a low-growing ground cover that retains and cleanses rainwater while moderating the building's internal temperature. The roof was part of an $18 million rainwater treatment system that collected and cleaned approximately 550 million gallons of stormwater annually, eliminating the need for a $50 million mechanical treatment facility. Porous paving allowed additional rainwater to filter into the ground rather than running off into storm drains. Native plantings throughout the site provided habitat for birds and insects, while reducing the need for irrigation and chemical maintenance. Today, the Rouge sits on 600 acres, roughly 30% of its original footprint. It employs approximately 6,000 workers, a fraction of the 100,000 who labored there at the complex's peak, but it remains one of Ford's largest facilities, and it has taken on new significance as the company transitions to electric vehicles. In September of 2020, Ford announced construction of the Ford Rouge Electric Vehicle Center, a $700 million facility for production of the F-150 Lightning electric pickup truck. In May of 2021, President Joe Biden toured the plant and drove a Lightning before it entered the market, endorsing electric vehicles during a speech that positioned the Rouge as a symbol of American industrial renewal. The transition to electric vehicle production has not been without challenges. The skills required to build an electric truck are different from those needed for internal combustion vehicles. Battery assembly requires different training, different safety protocols, different relationships between workers and machines. Some veteran Rouge workers have embraced the change, seeing it as an opportunity to be part of something new. Others have struggled with the adjustment, finding that decades of accumulated expertise no longer apply in the same ways. The supply chains that feed the F-150 Lightning are also different. Instead of steel and iron ore and coal, the new Rouge depends on lithium and cobalt and rare earth elements, materials sourced from mines in Australia and Chile, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The vertical integration that Henry Ford pioneered, the dream of controlling every step of production from raw material to finished product, has given way to a global network of suppliers and partners that no single company can fully control. Whether this represents progress or merely a different kind of dependency remains an open question. The same concerns about worker exploitation and environmental damage that plagued the Ford supply chain a century ago now attach to the cobalt mines of Congo, where child labor and dangerous working conditions produce the materials that make electric vehicles possible. The Rouge's transformation into a showcase of sustainable manufacturing cannot resolve these contradictions. It can only illustrate how difficult it is to build a truly ethical industrial system in a globalized economy. The Rouge Center, as the site is now called, includes 6 Ford factories and steelmaking operations run by Cleveland-Cliffs. Tours resumed in 2004 in cooperation with the Henry Ford Museum. The Rouge itself was designated a National Historic Landmark District in 1978, recognized for its architecture and historical importance. It inspired factory complexes around the world. Renault's Ile-Séguin factory in France, Gaz's facility in the Soviet Union, Volkswagen's Wolfsburg factory in Germany, Fiat's Mirafiori factory in Italy. Henry Ford's vision of vertical integration and continuous flow production became the model for industrial development across the globe. What lessons does the Rouge offer? Perhaps only that the pursuit of efficiency, taken to its logical extreme, tends to consume the very things it claims to serve. Henry Ford wanted to build a factory so perfect that human error would become impossible. He succeeded in a sense, but the cost of that perfection was the reduction of human beings to mechanical parts, interchangeable and expendable, valued only for the repetitive motions they could perform. The wages that were supposed to create loyal workers instead created compliance born of economic dependence. The control that was supposed to ensure quality instead produced resentment, resistance, and eventually the very unions that Ford had spent decades trying to destroy. The Rouge has stood on the banks of its namesake river for more than a century now. It has witnessed the rise and partial decline of American industrial supremacy. It has seen war and depression, prosperity and crisis, violence and reconciliation. It has employed millions of workers across 4 generations, from immigrants who arrived speaking no English to the sons and daughters and grandchildren who inherited their places on the line. The workers who built the Rouge have almost all passed from this world. The youngest of them, those who were hired in the final years before the Great Decline, are now in their 70s and 80s. Their memories of the plant are precious artifacts, windows into a world that no longer exists, and that can never be fully reconstructed from documents and photographs alone. They remember the sound, that is what they all say. The constant roar of machinery, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, and the rumble of conveyors. The sound was so loud that workers could not hear each other speak. They developed hand signals, gestures that communicated across the din of production. When they went home at night, the silence felt strange, almost threatening. Some workers reported that they could still hear the machines in their sleep, that the rhythm of the assembly line had become a permanent part of their nervous systems. They remember the heat, The blast furnaces where iron ore was transformed into molten metal reached temperatures of 2,000 degrees. Workers who tended these furnaces wore protective equipment that was never quite adequate, that left them drenched in sweat after minutes of exposure. In summer, the temperature inside the buildings could exceed 120 degrees. Men collapsed, some died, production continued. They remember the speed. The assembly line moved at a pace set by engineers who had calculated precisely how fast a human being could perform each task. There was no margin for error, no allowance for fatigue or distraction. Fall behind, and the entire line would suffer. The pressure was relentless, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. Workers developed repetitive strain injuries, carpal tunnel syndrome, chronic back problems from standing in the same position and making the same motions thousands of times per shift. And they remember the camaraderie. For all its hardships, the Rouge was a community. Workers knew each other's families, attended each other's weddings, mourned at each other's funerals. They shared lunch in the cafeterias, swapped stories in the parking lots, supported each other through strikes and layoffs, and the countless small crises of working-class life. The union that they fought so hard to establish became not just a bargaining agent, but a social institution, a source of identity and belonging that extended far beyond the workplace. This camaraderie was the one thing that the company could never control. The sociological department could inspect workers' homes and monitor their bank accounts, but it could not prevent the bonds that formed between men who shared the same experiences, faced the same dangers, bore the same burdens. The service department could beat union organizers and fire suspected sympathizers, but it could not extinguish the solidarity that arose naturally from collective labor. In the end, it was this solidarity that forced Ford to recognize its workers as something more than components in an industrial machine. There is a memorial at the Rouge complex now. It stands near the site of the 1999 power plant explosion, bearing the names and photographs of the 6 workers who died that day. Donald Harper, Cody Boatwright, Warren Blow, Ken Anderson, John Arsenault, Ron Maritz. These were their names. They went to work on a Monday afternoon in February, expecting to return home that evening, as they had returned home every evening for years. They did not return. The same could be said of the workers who died in the Hunger March of 1932. Joe York, Coleman Lenny, Joe de Blasio, Joe Bussell, Curtis Williams. And the same could be said of the countless workers who died more quietly from the accumulated effects of exposure to heat and noise and toxic substances, from the chronic conditions that assembly line labor inflicted on human bodies. Their names are not recorded on any memorial. They simply wore out, used up by the factory that had purchased their labor. This is the cost of industrial civilization. We purchased our automobiles with the labor of workers who stood at assembly lines for 8 and 10 and 12 hours at a stretch, who breathed air thick with coal dust and metal filings, who watched their bodies break down from the repetitive strain of tasks performed thousands of times per day. The owners of Ford Motor Company became fabulously wealthy. The consumers who purchased Ford automobiles enjoyed freedom and convenience. But the workers who made all of this possible often received far less than their labor was worth, and sometimes they paid with their health and their lives. Today, the Rouge River still flows past the complex that bears its name. It is cleaner now than it was in the days when industrial waste poured directly into its waters. For decades, the river had been essentially dead, its waters so polluted that no fish could survive in them. The channel that Ford's engineers had dredged to accommodate ore freighters had disrupted the natural flow patterns that once cleansed the waterway. Industrial runoff from dozens of factories along its banks had turned it into an open sewer, orange with iron oxide, black with coal dust, toxic with chemicals that no treatment plant of the era could remove. Beginning in the 1970s, environmental regulations forced a cleanup. The Rouge River has been the subject of one of the most ambitious watershed restoration projects in American history. Wetlands have been restored along its banks. Stormwater management systems have been installed to prevent polluted runoff from reaching the river. Fish have returned to waters that had not supported aquatic life within living memory. The recovery is far from complete, and the river will never be what it was before, industrialization. But it is no longer the ecological catastrophe it had become. The Rouge complex itself has undergone a parallel transformation. The ore freighters no longer make the journey from the mines of Minnesota to the docks of the Rouge. The raw materials that once arrived by water now arrive by truck and rail, sourced from suppliers around the world. The vertical integration that made the Rouge unique has given way to global supply chains that span continents and oceans. The Rouge of today is safer than the Rouge of 1932, when 5 workers were shot dead for demanding bread. It is more environmentally responsible than the Rouge of 1950, when smokestacks poured pollutants into the air and waste pipes discharged contamination into the water. It employs fewer workers, but those workers enjoy protections and benefits that their great-grandparents could scarcely have imagined. Yet something has been lost as well: the sense of purpose that came from being part of the largest factory in the world. The community that developed among workers who shared the same experiences and faced the same challenges. The pride that came from transforming raw materials into finished products, from watching iron ore become an automobile in a single continuous process. These things cannot be replicated in a facility that outsources most of its functions to specialized suppliers. The Rouge endures, change beyond recognition from what it was at its height, but still operating, still producing, still employing workers who punch the clock and assemble vehicles that will carry Americans down the highways of a nation that Henry Ford did more than almost anyone to create. The F-150 Lightning that rolls off the assembly line today is a very different machine from the Model T that rolled off the line a century ago, but it serves the same purpose: to provide transportation to people who could not otherwise afford it, to democratize mobility, to shrink the distances that once separated Americans from each other and from the opportunities they sought. The furnaces no longer glow orange with molten metal. The smokestacks no longer pour steam into a gray sky. But the legacy of what was built here surrounds us still. Every time we drive a car, every time we purchase a mass-produced good, every time we experience the benefits and bear the costs of industrial civilization, we are living in a world that the Rouge helped create. What we make of that inheritance is up to us.